Winston as Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 4, Chapter 10, The Triumvirate. To you all three, the senators of this great world. In Antony and Cleopatra, Act 2, Scene 6. It is pleasant to return to Paris after these Russian snows. Unluckily, we have also to return to Mr. Stanard Baker. Before President Wilson had departed, the question of the renewal of the armistice on February 12 had directly raised the issue of a preliminary peace. How much longer were we all to go on officially bound to hate the Germans, and indeed, since the blockade was still in operation, to starve them? How much longer were schemes for regenerating the world and the daily round of business to take precedence over the commonplaces of good sense and humanity? There must be peace, the armies must demobilize, and the troops come home. It was therefore necessary to fix the final limits of German martial power while time remained. It was agreed that a preliminary treaty containing military, naval, and air terms should be drafted forthwith by an expert committee. The records show that Wilson said he did not wish his absence to stop so important, essential, and urgent a work as the preparation of a preliminary peace. He hoped to return by March 13 or 15, allowing himself only a week in America. But he did not wish that during his unavoidable absence such questions as the territorial questions and questions of compensation should be held up. He had asked Colonel House to take his place while he was away. This statement was inconvenient for Mr. Stanard Baker. It threatened to spoil his second film effect, which was as follows. No sooner had the President left Paris on February 15 than the forces of opposition and discontent began to act. On February 24, resolutions were adopted by the Council of Ten which, if carried through, would wreck the entire American scheme for the peace. It was exceedingly shrewd strategy these skilled diplomatists played. They did not like the League as drafted, and they did not want the covenant in the treaty, but they made no direct attack on either proposal. The League was scarcely mentioned in the conferences until just before the President returned. Their strategy was as simple as it was ingenious. They had been left with resolutions which the President had strongly supported, to make quickly a preliminary peace treaty, including only military, naval, and air terms. What was easier or more obvious than to generalize that treaty, put into it also all the other terms that really mattered to them: boundaries, reparations, colonies. In short, crowd the whole piece into the preliminary treaty without any reference to the League. If the League got squeezed out in the process, or was consigned to some innocuous future conference after all the settlements were made, who cared? Thus, while it is too much to say that there was a direct plot, while Wilson was away, to kill the League or even cut it out of the treaty, one can affirm with certainty that there was an intrigue against his plan of a preliminary military and naval peace, which would have indirectly produced the same result. It seemed that every militaristic and nationalistic force came instantly to the front when Wilson had departed. Lloyd George had gone home, but instead of leaving the liberal leaders in control in Paris, men who were imbued with the purposes laid down in the League, Cecil, Smuts, and Barnes, who were indeed Lloyd George's associates on the British Peace Commission, he sent over Winston Churchill, the most militaristic of British leaders. Churchill was not a member of the peace delegation and had had nothing before to do with the peace conference. Moreover, he was a rampant opponent of the League. He proceeds to argue that Lloyd George, who began to think he had gone too far with this League business, gave instructions to Mr. Balfour to take advantage of President Wilson's temporary absence for the purpose of rupturing the policy of the League of Nations, and to further these evil ends he sent specially to Paris the very wicked author of this book. This charge has had a wide currency. The German writer Nowak repeats it. Lord Balfour had actually forestalled President Wilson in proposing that the armistice terms should be renewed without laying fresh obligations on the Germans. But that was already a week ago. Since then, Winston Churchill had arrived in Paris. Churchill, the Bolshevik hater, still filled with thoughts of war, filled with the same ideas as Marshal Foch for a promising campaign in the East, full also of contempt for the League of Nations, which, he declared with conviction, was useless to his country and no substitute for a navy. Subsequently, there had been an interchange of views between Winston Churchill and Marshal Foch. And now Lord Balfour proposed that after all it would be better at once to incorporate the essentials of the peace terms in the preliminaries of peace. Footnote. In Versailles, page 84. End of footnote. The correspondence printed in the last chapter will have sufficiently apprised the reader of the reasons which sent me to Paris. They were the only reasons. The only matter which concerned me at the 3 sessions which I attended of the Supreme Council was the quest for some policy in Russia. Absorbed in my own work, I was never even aware of these more spacious issues. I went to Paris on Russian business, and when it was clear no business could be done, I went home. Mr. Stannard Baker's mettle is, however, best judged from his own pages. It is necessary to his effect that President Wilson should be depicted as leaving Europe in the sure confidence that territorial and reparations questions would not be dealt with in his absence, and that such dealing would be a breach of faith. Yet there, in the procès-verbal of February 12, stood the awkward words of President Wilson. He did not wish that during his unavoidable absence such questions as the territorial questions and questions of compensation should be held up. But what of that? A stroke of the pen will cut it out. It does not fit the story. High ideals must be supported at all costs and by all methods. So the man to whom President Wilson entrusted all his most secret papers, with leave to publish as he pleased, in breach of all faith between the parties concerned, first garbles the record by omitting the vital sentence, and last perverts it by inserting after the words preliminary peace, as to military, naval, and air terms. The American author of Colonel House's papers has summed up his discreditable performance in some salt sentences. The papers of Colonel House, like the British Foreign Office memorandum, furnish clear indication that in making his charge of an intrigue, Mr. Baker has advanced assumptions and insinuations without a tittle of evidence. The House papers show Wilson discussing with House the very plans which Mr. Baker asserts would wreck the entire American scheme for the peace. They show House cabling to Wilson the progress of those plans through the Balfour Resolution, and in his cables of February 27 and March 4, cited above, explaining how he hoped to push the future of the League. They show that in order to maintain a semblance of probability in his charges against the British, Mr. Baker has been forced to omit essential passages from the official record. Footnote. Mr. D. Hunter Miller also writes of Mr. Baker's thesis. The effort to prove a plot where none existed could not well go further. In The Drafting of the Covenant, Part 1, page 98. End of footnote. It was a different President Wilson that crossed the Atlantic in the George Washington for the second time. He had had a rough time in the United States. The White House dinner to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee had revealed to him the implacable party rancor which he had provoked and by which he was pursued. Senators Knox and Lodge remained perfectly silent, refusing to ask any questions or to act in the spirit in which the dinner was given. Footnote by Colonel House, page 401. End of footnote. The Republicans had raised the spirit of Monroe against the League of Nations. If a quarrel arose between Spain and Brazil, or between England and Venezuela, and the League of Nations said Brazil or Venezuela were in the wrong, were the United States to be compelled to take sides with a European power simply because of impartial justice? This was a hard blow, and the President bent under it. He felt like General Smuts, who saw clearly that the mandatory system for colonies was of universal application except in regard to German Southwest Africa. At the Opera House in New York, the President, vexed by the unpitying opposition which he knew he must encounter, had used an almost naked threat. The covenant of the League of Nations, he had suggested, would be so intertwined with the treaty that the two could not be separated. The American reaction to this had been distinctly hostile. The George Washington this time carried to Europe a man who had learned much. He now knew that the wicked Old World statesmen were backed by even more deplorable Old World nations, and that the American idealist would be repudiated by his own. The teach the world theme was over. The immediate need was to emerge without discredit from exceedingly delicate and responsible transactions. On his first voyage, all his moral indignation had been concentrated upon the Old World. On the second, at least 2/3 of it was generously distributed to the New. Then his purpose had been to compel the policies of Europe to his views. Now it was the Senate of the United States which stood in need of discipline. Indeed, he had almost a fellow feeling for those European statesmen and diplomatists who, like him, were at grips with unfair, intractable forces. Was it not time they should help each other? How could any solutions of world affairs be reached if mobs and senates and 500 gifted journalists interfered? 3 or 4 men talking quietly on the dead level might avert breakdown and chaos if they acted quickly. After all, Lloyd George and Clemenceau, the trusted, acclaimed leaders of immense parliamentary and democratic majorities, were not unworthy comrades. He had met them now, and he understood their quality and the causes of their strength. He envied them their national credentials. They were conciliatory, considerate, earnestly desirous of his goodwill, and yet resolute in their country's cause. He might not be able to give justice to the world, or even to define it in set terms, but the 3 of them together could give peace. There is no authority for saying that these were the reflections of President Wilson on his voyage. It is mere surmise. All that is known is that on his arrival he was far from pleased with Colonel House. House had already adapted himself to the relaxing atmosphere of Europe. All sorts of hitherto unauthorized ideas like, we must settle something, we must face facts, everyone must concede a lot, had laid hold of the colonel's calm, benevolent, and extremely practical mind. Wilson had not wished to see on his second arrival at Brest House's finger pointing the path which he had probably already himself resolved to tread. So he said to House, "Your dinner, that is the dinner you suggested, To the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was a failure as far as getting together was concerned. What had happened while he had been away? Mr. Lloyd George had gone home. Monsieur Clemenceau was, on February 19, fired at and wounded by an anarchist. He was for some weeks incapacitated. The commission appointed in February, on President Wilson's motion to draw up preliminary naval, military and air terms for Germany, had been expected to report within 48 hours. They had, however, found the task vastly more difficult than the President had expected. A whole month had passed, and the generals and admirals were still in the midst of their labors. Meanwhile, however, Mr. Balfour, who in the absence of the three heads of governments became naturally the leading figure of the conference, had made an immense effort to hasten and conclude the work of the commissions upon the rest of the peace treaty. On February 22, he told the Supreme Council that a general feeling of impatience was now becoming manifest in all countries on account of the apparent slow progress the conference was making in the direction of final peace. Supported by Lansing and House, and with the assent of the still prostrate Clemenceau, he obtained from the conference a resolution of which the first clause ran: First, without prejudice to the decision of the Supreme War Council to present naval, military and air conditions of peace to Germany at an early date, the Conference agrees that it is desirable to proceed without delay to the consideration of other preliminary peace terms with Germany and to press on the necessary investigations with all possible speed. He also carried a motion that the work of the territorial commissions should be completed and presented by March 8. The whole of the real work of the conference, driven forward insistently from above, now began to advance with remarkable rapidity. The commissions, which in the lack of steady control had hitherto been ambling off indefinitely into inquiries and discussions, now rallied to precise commands to produce conclusions forthwith. From every quarter, early in March, they began to present reports. By the time Wilson returned, on March 13, most of the great territorial issues had reached the point when final decision could be taken by the chiefs. But the military terms, which were to have been so speedily disposed of, were still lagging on the road. It therefore became possible again to contemplate bringing the whole of the work on the treaty to a common and simultaneous conclusion. There is no doubt that Mr. Balfour had during his 3 weeks of virtual ascendancy achieved an extraordinary transformation in the whole position. Whereas in the middle of February the work of the conference was drifting off almost uncontrollably into futility, all was now brought back in orderly fashion to the real. The decks were cleared for action, and the long-looked-for conflict of wills could now at last begin. President Wilson at no time challenged the decisions taken in his absence. On the contrary, he approved with increasing cordiality the work of the Balfour period. He saw how scrupulously his own position had been safeguarded by the steady and dexterous hands into which the conference had fallen. He realized that all the main issues were now presented uncompromised, intact, and ripe for decision. But the Council of 10, or Council of 50, as it had become, was no instrument to settle or even discuss the crucial questions between the great powers. An organism more compact, more secret, more intimate was imperatively demanded, and to this the minds of all the chiefs were driven by the steady pressure of facts. The actual crisis arose upon the report of the Commission on the future frontiers of Poland and Germany. The Commission, among other things, had assigned the whole of Upper Silesia to Poland, as well as Danzig and the Polish corridor. Mr. Lloyd George at once stigmatized the report as unjust, since according to the statistics of the Commission itself, the number of Germans to be assigned to Polish sovereignty was too great. He therefore moved that the report should be sent back to the Commission. The Commission reconsidered it, but refused to alter their recommendations. The French championed the Commission, tension arose and leakage followed. Lord Northcliffe bitterly attacked the Prime Minister in the Paris Daily Mail, urging that he had no right to override the opinion of the experts upon the Commission and revealing passages from his statements in the secret discussions of the Council of Ten. According to present-day opinion, Mr. Lloyd George was, of course, entirely in the right. The proposals of the Commission were indefensible. The members of the Commission were not in any real sense of the word experts, but whether or not, it is for experts to advise and for ministers and heads of governments to decide. Angered by the leakage and Lord Northcliffe's attacks, the Prime Minister successfully broke up the Council of Ten. From March 20, President Wilson, Mr. Lloyd George, Monsieur Clemenceau, and Signor Orlando met regularly in secret conversations, at which not even secretaries were present. For the first time since the conclusion of the armistice, there began that thorough and frank discussion which should have taken place 3 months before. The Council of 10, or 50, was now reduced to the 5 foreign ministers and still continued for a while to meet, but deprived of all important business and of all the men who had the power to settle, it perished painlessly of inanition. We now reach a page of the peace conference story which may well be called Exodus. As a prelude to acceptance of the brutal fact that they must agree, every one of the Big Four threatened to quit the conference. Mr. Lloyd George was first and far the most artistic. He assigned no specific point of disagreement. He was distressed at the slow progress of the treaty. He feared he was merely wasting his time in Paris. Meanwhile, he had direct and urgent responsibilities in England. The Cabinet, the House of Commons, the industrial situation, all required his immediate personal attention. Since no progress seemed likely in Paris, he must return home and get on with his job. He could come back later if there was any sign of some practical work being done upon the treaty. He fixed March 18 as the date of his departure. This prospect and the suggestion that there was more important work to be done in London than in Paris filled his compeers with alarm. They knew well that no progress could be made in his absence, yet the ground he had chosen was unassailable. Every effort was made to persuade him to remain, but it was not until he had received on March 17 a joint letter, since published by Colonel House, signed by Wilson, Clemenceau, and Orlando, begging him to remain, if only for another 2 weeks, that he was pleased to yield. He consented to remain, but in a strengthened position. Clemenceau and Wilson had long been ripening for a trial of strength. House has made us aware of the striking interchange which arose on March 28 out of the discussions about the Saar Valley coalfields. Then, if France does not get what she wishes, said the President, she will refuse to act with us. In that event, do you wish me to return home? I do not wish you to go home, said Clemenceau, but I intend to do so myself, and left the house. In this rough fashion did the tiger deal with his opponent. Moreover, he had only to go round the corner. But Wilson's position was very different. To recross the Atlantic was final and irrevocable. Nevertheless, in the face of Clemenceau's continued threat to withdraw the French delegation from the conference and in the despondency following an attack of influenza, the President telegraphed on April 7 for the George Washington to return to France. His faithful secretary, Mr. Tamalti, who remained on guard at home, warned the President in the bluntest terms that his exodus would be looked upon by his friends and foes in America as an act of impatience and petulance, not accepted here in good faith, most unwise and fraught with most dangerous possibilities, a desertion. This was decisive. He could not quit. He must go through with it. And meanwhile Clemenceau had said no more about withdrawal and continued his daily attendances upon the conference. The last exodus was that of Orlando. When, upon the question of Fiume, President Wilson threatened to appeal over his head to the Italian people and on the strength of his 3 days' visit to Italy exclaimed, "I know the Italian people better than you do," Orlando went straight to the railway station and actually departed in voluble indignation to Rome. He at least carried out his threat, but this only consolidated the others. The Triumvirate found a common ground in standing together against him. After waiting a fortnight for appeals to his higher nature which never arrived, he came back of his own accord in time to sign the treaty. Mr. Lloyd George had remained in France, but while the Council of Ten were fading away and the meeting of the Four were gradually assuming a formal character, he paid a brief visit to Fontainebleau. Footnote. Actually 24 hours only. End of footnote. There he wrote his famous memorandum of March 25. This document has already been published, but since it expresses more completely and explicitly Mr. Lloyd George's sentiments about the peace settlement, and since the views he expressed corresponded very fairly with those of the people in whose name he spoke, it will be well to give some typical extracts here. Some considerations for the peace conference before they finally draft their terms. When nations are exhausted by wars in which they have put forth all their strength and which leave them tired, bleeding, and broken, it is not difficult to patch up a peace that may last until the generation which experienced the horrors of the war has passed away. Pictures of heroism and triumph only tempt those who know nothing of the sufferings and terrors of war. It is therefore comparatively easy to patch up a peace which will last for 30 years. What is difficult, however, is to draw up a peace which will not provoke a fresh struggle when those who have had practical experience of what war means have passed away. To achieve redress, our terms may be severe, they may be stern and even ruthless, but at the same time they can be so just that the country on which they are imposed will feel in its heart that it has no right to complain. But injustice, arrogance, displayed in the hour of triumph, will never be forgotten or forgiven. For these reasons I am, therefore, strongly averse to transferring more Germans from German rule to the rule of some other nation than can possibly be helped. I cannot conceive any greater cause of future war than that the German people, who have certainly proved themselves one of the most vigorous and powerful races in the world, should be surrounded by a number of small states, many of them consisting of people who have never previously set up a stable government for themselves, but each of them containing large masses of Germans clamoring for reunion with their native land. The proposal of the Polish Commission that we should place 2,100,000 Germans under the control of a people which is of a different religion and which has never proved its capacity for stable self-government throughout its history must, in my judgment, lead sooner or later to a new war in the east of Europe. What I have said about the Germans is equally true to the Magyars. There will never be peace in southeastern Europe if every little state now coming into being is to have a large Magyar irredenta within its borders. I would therefore take as a guiding principle of the peace that as far as it is humanly possible, the different races should be allocated to their motherlands, and that this human criterion should have precedence over considerations of strategy or economics or communications, which can usually be adjusted by other means. Secondly, I would say that the duration for the payments of reparation ought to disappear, if possible, with the generation which made the war. The greatest danger that I see in the present situation is that Germany may throw in her lot with Bolshevism and place her resources, her brains, her vast organizing power at the disposal of the revolutionary fanatics whose dream it is to conquer the world for Bolshevism by force of arms. This danger is no more chimera. The present government in Germany is weak. It has no prestige. Its authority is challenged. It lingers merely because there is no alternative but the Spartakists. And Germany is not ready for Spartakism as yet. But the argument which the Spartakists are using with great effect at this very time is that they alone can save Germany from the intolerable conditions which have been bequeathed her by the war. They offer to free the German people from indebtedness to the Allies and indebtedness to their own richer classes. They offer them complete control of their own affairs and the prospect of a new heaven and earth. It is true that the price will be heavy. There will be 2 or 3 years of anarchy, perhaps bloodshed, but at the end the land will remain, the people will remain, the greater part of the houses and the factories will remain, and the railways and the roads will remain, and Germany, having thrown off her burdens, will be able to make a fresh start. If Germany goes over to the Spartakists, it is inevitable that she should throw in her lot with the Russian Bolsheviks. Once that happens, all Eastern Europe will be swept into the orbit of the Bolshevik Revolution, and within a year we may witness the spectacle of nearly 300 million people organized into a vast Red Army under German instructors and German generals, equipped with German cannon and German machine guns, and prepared for a renewal of the attack on Western Europe. This is a prospect which no one can face with equanimity. Yet the news which came from Hungary yesterday shows only too clearly that this danger is no fantasy. And what are the reasons alleged for this decision? They are mainly the belief that large numbers of Magyars are to be handed over to the control of others. If we are wise, we shall offer to Germany a peace which, while just, will be preferable for all sensible men to the alternative of Bolshevism. I would therefore put it in the forefront of the peace that once she accepts our terms, especially reparation, we will open to her the raw materials and markets of the world on equal terms with ourselves, and will do everything possible to enable the German people to get upon their legs again. We cannot both cripple her and expect her to pay. Finally, we must offer terms which a responsible government in Germany can expect to be able to carry out. If we present terms to Germany which are unjust or excessively onerous, no responsible government will sign them. Certainly the present weak administration will not. From every point of view, therefore, it seems to me that we ought to endeavor to draw up a peace settlement as if we were impartial arbiters, forgetful of the passions of the war. The settlement ought to have 3 ends in view. First of all, it must do justice to the Allies by taking into account Germany's responsibility for the origin of the war and for the way in which it was fought. Secondly, it must be a settlement which a responsible German government can sign in the belief that it can fulfill the obligations it incurs. Thirdly, it must be a settlement which will contain in itself no provocations for future wars, and which will constitute an alternative to Bolshevism, because it will commend itself to all reasonable opinion as a fair settlement of the European problem. To my mind, it is idle to endeavor to impose a permanent limitation of armaments upon Germany unless we are prepared similarly to impose a limitation upon ourselves. I should like to ask why Germany, if she accepts the terms we consider just and fair, should not be admitted to the League of Nations, at any rate as soon as she has established a stable and democratic government. Would it not be an inducement to her both to sign the terms and to resist Bolshevism? Might it not be safer that she should be inside the League than that she should be outside it? Finally, I believe that until the authority and effectiveness of the League of Nations has been demonstrated, the British Empire and the United States ought to give to France a guarantee against the possibility of a new German aggression. France has special reason for asking for such a guarantee. She has twice been attacked and twice invaded by Germany in half a century. She has been so attacked because she has been the principal guardian of liberal and democratic civilization against Central European autocracy on the continent of Europe. It is right that the other great Western democracies should enter into an understanding which will ensure that they stand by her side in time to protect her against invasion, should Germany ever threaten her again, or until the League of Nations has proved its capacity to preserve the peace and liberty of the world. If, however, the peace conference is really to secure peace and prove to the world a complete plan of settlement, which all reasonable men will recognize as an alternative preferable to anarchy, it must deal with the Russian situation. Bolshevik imperialism does not merely menace the states of Russia's borders. It threatens the whole of Asia and is as near to America as it is to France. It is idle to think that the peace conference can separate, however sound a peace it may have arranged with Germany, if it leaves Russia as it is today. I do not propose, however, to complicate the question of the peace with Germany by introducing a discussion of the Russian problem. I mention it simply in order to remind ourselves of the importance of dealing with it as soon as possible. Clemenceau replied with asperity in writing. He suggested that Lord George's magnanimity was achieved exclusively at the expense of France and the continental states, while England had received all the advantages and securities which were of interest to her. But what would be the results of following the method suggested by the note of March 26? A certain number of total and definite guarantees will be acquired by maritime nations which have not known an invasion. The surrender of the German colonies would be total and definite. The surrender of the German navy would be total and definite. The surrender of a large portion of the German merchant fleet would be total and definite. The exclusion of Germany from foreign markets would be total and would last for some time. On the other hand, partial and temporary solutions would be reserved for the continental countries, that is to say, those which have suffered most from the war. The reduced frontiers suggested for Poland and Bohemia would be partial solutions. The defensive agreement offered to France for the protection of her territory would be a temporary solution. The proposed regime for the coalfields of the Tsar would be temporary. Here we have a condition of inequality which might risk leaving a bad impression upon the after-war relations between the Allies, more important than the after-war relations between Germany and the Allies. Mr. Stanard Baker had the Lloyd George memorandum before him when he wrote his history. He admired it greatly. A peace resting upon military coercion could never, he felt, be anything but a curse to the world. No finer expression of his feeling, he wrote, based on a far-sighted perception of the varieties of the situation, can be found than in a memorandum sent to President Wilson by General Tasker H. Bliss on March 25. It was called "Some Considerations for the Peace Conference Before They Finally Draft Their Terms." A few pregnant sentences may be quoted, etc. General Bliss, he continues, was one of the few members of the conference that never lost his sense of perspective and who saw that there was a great danger of ruining the whole work of peace if the conference should produce a treaty against which the mass of German opinion would at once revolt. This is probably the most astonishing blunder which any man claiming to write a standard history and armed for that purpose with a mass of exclusive official and authentic information has ever committed. Little did Mr. Baker dream when he penned his tributes to General Bliss that they should really have been directed to another address. Bitter must have been his chagrin when he realized that his praise belongs not to the distinguished American soldier whom all respect, but to an unregenerate old-world politician. This is the concluding specimen of Mr. Baker's fidelity in the search of truth with which the reader will be troubled. I have dwelt upon his work with attention because of the solemn character of the mission entrusted to him and the stream of precious knowledge placed in his charge by President Wilson. It is disquieting to think how many conscientious citizens of the United States must have drunk from his infected fountain. But fortunately, it has not been left to English writers to discredit Mr. Baker. The pages of Dr. Hunter Miller and of the editor of Colonel House's papers have remorselessly exposed his errors, and indeed vices, to the alert, critical faculty of the American public and to their inherent desire for truth and justice. It is not the purpose of these chapters to retell the story of the peace conference, but only to guide the reader to some of its salient features. We have nevertheless surveyed the general scene and its actors. Nearly 5 months have passed since the fighting ended, and it is only now that the real making of the peace begins. 4 men, for a time to be reduced to 3, each the responsible head of a great victor state, are all that are left. The 500 gifted journalists, the 27 eager nations, the Council of 10 or 50, the 58 commissions, so rich in eminent personages, have all melted down to 3 men. Henceforward they will stand together. They have learned to respect each other and to trust each other. They have become colleagues and comrades in an adventure of much danger and unequaled difficulties. Each knows he must make serious concessions to reach agreement. Each knows that agreement must be reached, and all resolve to give a speedy peace to the world and answer unitedly, promptly, and to the best of their ability, for good or for ill, the 100 hard questions which stand open. We shall see in the next chapter what some of these questions were and how they were decided. For a month, from March 20 to April 19, they argue and consult alone, all speaking English. Much common ground is won, but it is not entrenched each night. Even the rendezvous of the 4 sometimes fail. One goes to Monsieur Clemenceau's rooms and one to President Wilson's. Organization now alone is needed. Then they admit as secretary Maurice Henke. He listens to all that is said and keeps his record and tells them at the end of every day what they have settled. From that moment their decisions flow out to jurists and officials in a swiftly growing stream. By May 7, the Treaty of Versailles is printed, and on the 9th a plenary session of the conference accepts with resignation or resentment the accomplished fact. It was now time to summon the enemy. Early in May, the German envoys presented themselves in the Palace of Versailles to receive the volume in which the preliminary terms of peace were incorporated. And at the end of June, peace, in substantial accordance with these terms, was duly signed. Meanwhile, Germany had been traveling fast. German writers are prone to dwell upon the humiliations their people endured at the hands of the conquerors in this period. But their own country was all the while the scene of events most important and helpful to them and to civilization. Some brief account has been given in these pages of the Russian Revolution. The German Revolution was the paroxysm of an incomparably stronger and more highly nerved organization. It passed across our anxious, satiated, jaded consciousness with no more attention than surviving troops just withdrawn into rest quarters after battle would pay to a distant cannonade. The story requires a book to tell. The interest is enhanced by comparison with what happened in Russia. So many of the conditions and episodes and their sequence are exactly reproduced. The nation is beaten in war, the fleet and army mutiny and dissolve, the emperor is deposed, and authority bankrupt is repudiated by all. Workmen's and soldiers' councils are set up, a socialist government is hustled into office. Upon the famine-stricken homeland return millions of soldiers, quivering from long-drawn torment, aching with defeat. The police have disappeared. Industry is at a standstill. The mob are hungry. It is winter. All the agencies which destroyed Russia are ready. They are organized. Each individual knows his task. The whole procedure of communist revolution is understood and scheduled. The Russian experiment stands as a model. In Karl Liebknecht, in Rosa Luxemburg, in Dittmann, in Kautsky, and a score of others are the would-be Lenins and Trotskys of the Teutonic agony. Everything is tried and everything happens, but it does not happen the same way. The communists seize the greater part of the capital, but the seat of government is defended. The would-be Constitutional Assembly is attacked, but the assailants are repulsed. A handful of loyal officers, loyal to Germany, disguised as privates, but well armed with grenades and machine guns, guard with their lives the frail nucleus of civic government. They are only a handful, but they win. A naval division infected with Bolshevism seizes the palace. They are expelled after bloody fighting by faithful troops. In the mutinies which overturned authority in almost every regiment, the officers were deprived of their epaulettes and swords, but not one was murdered. In the midst of all we discern a rugged, simple figure, a socialist workman and trade unionist, Noske by name. Appointed Minister of National Defense by the Social Democratic government, furnished by them with dictatorial powers, he does not fail the German people. A foreign opinion of German heroes is necessarily very detached and can only be expressed with diffidence. But in the long line of kings, statesmen and warriors, which stretches from Frederick to Hindenburg, it may be that Noske has his place. A son of the people, amid universal confusion acting without fear in the public cause. The fiber and intellect of all the German tribes enabled the provisional government to hold elections. Always the reader will see in these pages the same tactics by the same forces. Their one object, to prevent the people from choosing a parliament. In Russia they have succeeded. In Germany they fail. Presently we shall see them fail in Ireland. representative government being still alive thanks to shot and steel, machine guns, trench mortars and Flammenwerfer, 30 millions of German men and women, 90% of the electorate, recorded their votes, and from that hour a free and supreme parliament became the central fact in German life. It was therefore as a united nation, which in the hour of disaster had risen superior to despair, that Germany came to Versailles.